Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a classic review of the Yes record, Close to the Edge. Famed progressive rock band from the UK, Yes. And this is easily their most acclaimed record. Created while the band was in the middle of their most celebrated lineup. You had John Anderson on vocals, Chris Squire, whose very crunchy, roaring bass tone can be heard all over this LP, Steve Harris on guitar, Bill Bruford on drums, and then we have, of course, Rick Wakeman on keyboards, possibly progressive rock's greatest living keyboardist. And also at this time, Yes was kicking off a string of fantastic progressive rock records that they released throughout the 70s, including this LP, the Yes album, Fragile, and later albums such as... But Yes's discography featured more than just progressive rock. The band's early work actually had some influences coming from the psych rock realm. And later in their output from the 80s and 90s, which is maybe some of the most polarizing and controversial stuff they would ever drop, there was a huge pop music influence coming into the fold. It was on records like this where you just heard Yes playing like some hard rock or some adult-oriented rock or synth pop and new wave. The band even put out a remix album in the early 2000s, which I'm sure a lot of their fans would like to just kind of assume doesn't exist. And it's also worth noting that Yes has been incredibly active since the release of their first album. They have consistently dropped records throughout the years, even if some of them haven't really been as well received as others because they kind of changed their sound and style. A lot of those Yes records from the 80s and 90s haven't really been looked upon that favorably with time passing, but the band still kind of stuck to putting out music, and they evolved as I guess they kind of saw fit and kept up with the times. And I personally don't really find albums like 90125 to be terrible. I just think that a lot of people who tend to gravitate toward Yes's music love them mostly for their older stuff, love them for their progressive rock stuff, and as far as progressive rock sits on the totem pole in regards to pop music, it's definitely a lot higher with progressive rock fans. But in a way, I think what set Yes apart from a lot of the other progressive rock bands of their day was their openness toward other more accessible expressions of modern music. Because across Yes's discography, there was this really high level of versatility shown, from albums like Close to the Edge to some really well-crafted pop music. And I think that diversity and that versatility in a way is also shown on this record, where we're getting these really flashy, fantastic keyboards, some very colorful and funky guitar licks, growling bass lines, very punchy drums, and some awesome, heavenly, soaring vocal harmonies. And all of these things are assembled into this winding, complex web of ever-changing and morphing rock symphonies. This record kicks off in a very serene fashion with the sound of birds and some fluttering pretty electronics, which actually pop up periodically throughout this record. It's very beautiful, very psychedelic, but then as the guitars, the bass, the drums pop in, we're getting these ascending melodies and guitar chords that are creating this really tight, monstrous jam. There is this fluidity to the playing on this record that you really only get when you hear a group of people performing and playing together, just very naturally, you know, no click tracks or anything like that. But the band just has this amazing ability to stop on a dime to make way for John Anderson's just really bright vocal harmonies. It's awesome the level of detail that the band has worked into this record by not only experimenting compositionally, but just with the way that they're able to sort of perform and lay all of these incredible details to tape, which must have been an arduous process. This introduction eventually gives way to the track's theme melody, which is fantastic. It's an amazing theme melody. And then we get the initial groove of the verse, the first verse on this track, and it's a hard freaking groove. And for a moment, this groove stops to allow these fluttering keyboards to come in once again. This is just another moment where Yes is incorporating these really awesome bits of color, playing these little instrumental games to keep things interesting and just make this a highly, again, detailed album. Yes had a very maximal approach to rock music composition, and it's part of what made their songs, especially on this record, so engaging. And it's also worth noting that this track also kind of reminds me of something that Rush would be doing just years down the road in the 80s, but in a way that was much more sleek and I guess commercially viable. A little later down the road, the first big refrain of the record pops up, "Seasons will pass you by." It's a very catchy moment on the record. Maybe the first moment on this LP where Yes's pop sensibility is shining through, and the band's prowess for sweet vocal music is shown a little bit later as you get all of the instrumentation kind of melting away, and then we're just getting all these vocal layers harmonizing in a really beautiful Beach Boys-esque way. These vocal harmonies trade off with some very grand organ sequences, which are huge. They're gorgeous. They sound like this massive church organ. This organ is powerful. It is just monstrous. It's emotional. It's a very emotional moment. These vocals and this organ sort of trading off, and the organ occasionally sounds very dark and very sinister. For me, is just kind of a tearjerker moment in the middle of this record. And matching this part up with the refrain of the next track, the "I get up, I get down" moment on this album was just great. And Yes continues to hit us with just one compositional idea after the next. And what's awesome is that they all flow together so well. These screaming keyboard riffs just enter the fold and they change the vibe of the song entirely, and they're just kind of meant as a bit of a palate cleanser so that the band can incorporate these squelchy, warped, just bouncy keyboard riffs against these bustling drums, which kind of reminds me of stuff that Battles would be doing, experimental rock band Battles would be doing decades later down the road. I mean, if you listen to the plinky, just ear-piercing, twangy quality of these synthesizers against these drums, I think you're going to pick up elements that have showed up on Mirrored and Gloss Drop. Yes packs so much into these songs, and this is all technically like the title track, the first track on the record. It just has these multiple phases or sub-songs within it. This opening song is about like 18 minutes long, takes up the first side of the record, and when this track is over, I feel like I've gotten a whole album already. And the final part of this track, Seasons of Man, brings back all of the previous refrains showcased in the song. And again, it's like another powerful emotional moment, especially as refrains like "I get up, I get down" are sort of stretched out and we're just getting these long grand notes. It's on moments like this where Yes is showing that they have the complexity and the refinement of like a symphonic or a classical tune, but they're giving it the immediacy of a rock song. Now, side 2 of this record features a couple more tracks. It's kind of like Yes is giving us this handful of mini little rock symphonies, and the second side of this LP kicks off with some really lush acoustic guitar, very rich progressive folk music kicking off the second half of this LP. And as more electric instrumentation creeps into the mix, this song gains just a panoramic, huge, just monstrous heaviness that is almost awe-inspiring. And once again, Yes kind of melts this extra instrumentation away to only put the spotlight on the acoustic guitar again, in a moment that feels very emotional, very somber. I wouldn't say Yes is as theatrical as some of their progressive rock contemporaries like Jethro Tull and King Crimson, but this is just another really compositionally powerful moment for me on this record, and really showcases how dynamic the band was. And from here, Yes glides into some really pleasant, beautiful 70s styled rock music, and I think, again, just the word of the day with this record is versatility. Also, that this album comes from a band that understands the significance of songwriting. Flashy playing is fantastic, but if you don't have a great song to plug it into, you're only fighting half the battle. This record's final moments are delivered by this 9-minute cut called Siberian Khatru. It kind of finishes this record on a very upbeat note, not really anything too grand or ambitious to sort of end this album off. It's a really good track, don't get me wrong, but it definitely doesn't feel in line with the previous 2 songs in that you're kind of getting this symphonic, grand musical statement with a bunch of sub-tracks held within it. Rather, this track feels a bit like a medley of a bunch of different popular genres of the day. There are guitar licks, and there are bass lines, and there are keyboard parts throughout this song that have a very clear and obvious influence coming from blues music or country music, as well as just hard rock, and classical. Throughout this song, Yes is making these very bold and intentional genre references for the listener to kind of pick them up and be like, oh, okay, wow, we're really bouncing all over the place stylistically. I wouldn't say this song is as cohesive as the previous two tracks, nor is it, I guess, as grandly composed. It kind of feels like at the first moments of the previous two songs, the band is really focused on setting up some kind of really big musical stage for what would be coming up later in the song, which is some kind of big payoff. Whereas on this track, it doesn't really feel like the band has any kind of big payoff coming. It's just this constant barrage of very energetic, upbeat, rock-based musical movements. So again, in that sense, I'm maybe not as head over heels over this closing track as I am the previous two songs, but again, it's still an interesting experiment, a cool way for the band to end the record on an upbeat note. And also that fade out at the very end. Ugh, didn't care for that fade out. But again, I appreciate how difficult it must have been to lay this kind of music to tape. And even though this isn't one of the best songs or one of the best musical moments on the entire record, it is something special, and it is a really cool piece of music, and something that I could see and understand that they wouldn't want to leave off of the record, especially since omitting this song would have made the album so short. Overall, gotta say, this record is a progressive rock must for multiple reasons. It's great songwriting, the fantastic performances, and on top of that, Yes was able to, on this record, make a great prog rock album, make a prog rock classic, while keeping some very clear connections to the styles of music, the more accessible styles of music, that influenced progressive rock so much. Some of which I think a lot of progressive rock fans who are of the more snooty variety would like to imagine in their heads that progressive rock has no connection to the peasants' music. Ugh. It's one thing to be a great virtuous musician, but to be a great virtuous musician with just a wide palette of tastes and a lot of different influences and a lot of versatility, I think is a greater thing, and something that Yes showcased themselves to be throughout their career, especially on this record where I think they hit a perfect balance between more progressive, complex rock stylings and then mixing that with some catchier elements too. I love this record. It's a great record. I hope you can give a listen to it, and that's it, man. You're the best. Anthony Fantano. Yes. Transition. Have you given this record a listen? If you have, what did you think of it? What do you think of it? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Why would you hate it? It's an amazing record. You're the best. Anthony Fantano. Yes. Close to the edge. Forever.